The National Energy Regulator of South Africa has approved the 3 licenses needed for Eskom's transmission company to operate independently from the embattled power utility. So traditionally what we've known as Eskom to be is one made up of 3 divisions which make up 90% of South Africa's energy. But over the last decade there has been quite a bit of malfeasance that has led to the deterioration of the fiscal health of Eskom. Let's take a look at what Nersa approved here. So this will be known as the national company, the National Transmission Company of South Africa, if we could just take a look at that. And it's received 3 important licenses. These include an operating licensing, a trading license, as well as an import and export license. And then if we take a the final component here, which is quite important to consider, is that this forms part of the transmission development plan, and that means we have to increase capacity. So right now South Africa needs about 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines, and that'll cost over 200 billion rand over a few years. And of course this is going to be key for that investment to now be allowed in so that that infrastructure can be created. Let's bring in Dominic Brown from the AIDC joining us this afternoon. Dominic, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for your patience. Let's start with what was given to the transmission company yesterday, and really the kind of opportunities that this is going to be unlocking for the National Transmission Company of South Africa.
Thanks, Rafiwe. Perhaps I can unpack this in a number of different ways, and I'll come to your question momentarily. But I think the first point is, as you indicate, it's important that we do increase grid capacity. The International Energy Agency, for example, argued that electricity grids could prove to be the weak link in the transformation of the power sector, and it has major implications for reliability and security of energy supply. And as you have greater levels of renewable energy penetration or variable energy penetration into the grid, generally above 10% of installed capacity, necessitates increased system balancing capacity as well as demand regulation, so improved system flexibility. And without this, efforts to decarbonize power generation will confront serious technical roadblocks. And already we're seeing some of this manifesting itself in Vietnam and Mexico, which had to cancel their renewable energy generation programs given a lack of grid capacity. As you indicate, South Africa will require to build at least 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines by 2040 to facilitate greater renewable energy generation at the cost that you mentioned. But even before we get there, I think that brings me to my second point, which is that currently we already do not have sufficient grid capacity in South Africa, which is an obstacle to allow for new energy generation from wind and solar to come on board. So we're already facing serious constraints in this regard. So this is the first thing. I think it's important to acknowledge this and to acknowledge that it's going to require large levels of investment to facilitate it. Now, the second point...
please continue.
Sorry. Thank you. The second point, I think, relates to the question of the development of the National Transmission Company of South Africa, which is part of the process of unbundling Eskom into 3 separate entities, the breaking of a vertically integrated public utility. And we are currently in the second step of a 3-step process, which is about functional separation of various aspects of Eskom's generation, distribution and transmission and distribution, sorry. And the primary objective of the establishment of the National Transmission Company, an independent grid, is to provide non-discriminating grid access to all generators of energy. In other words, buying energy indiscriminately from all power generators. Now, this has a range of critical implications, okay? In the first instance, And we should weigh then up whether this helps to address the question of grid capacity. And our argument as AIDC is no, that it doesn't. One, transfers the risk of the investment for the grid to the state, and two, through the creation of the independent grid and the unbundling of Eskom, it's about creating an enabling environment for greater liberalization of the energy sector.
Dominic, just to interrupt you there, in the interest of time, I want to pick up on that point that you've made just now, which is very important, the transfer of the investment to the state or to other organs that would run it, so that we do see the development of this infrastructure. The kind of oversight that we're going to need to see here, because we say we need this over a period of a decade, and that's not a very long time. If we take a look at how things are going, and the oversight is going to need to be on the ball from the very beginning, and any kind of malfeasance is going to have to be prevented. And I wonder if, when we garner this kind of investment, which we will, I'm sure, if it can be managed in the appropriate manner.
I'm sure it could, but I'm trying to indicate that there's actually a bigger a challenge that we're facing in terms of ensuring energy security in this country, and in order to overcome problems of energy supply. So as you have an independent transmission grid that does buy energy indiscriminately, that there's going to be additional costs to Eskom from the purchasing of this energy from independent power producers, which will increase the primary energy costs of Eskom. This, alongside a reduction in sales volumes as people opt out of purchasing energy from the energy utility, will accelerate Eskom's death spiral. Then when you add the additional factor that it would probably be the state would be required to finance the investment in the grid, even if it would be about facilitating greater private sector involvement, and greater levels of for-profit renewable energies. Now, beyond the acceleration of the Eskom death spiral, which would mean that there would be higher costs imposed on people who cannot opt out of the grid, would therefore result in rising energy prices, even above what we're seeing currently, which would have adverse impacts in terms of addressing the problem of energy poverty for the majority of people in the country. So to sum up, maybe, I have very little anxiety about the possibility of the management of the process. My bigger, and AIDC's bigger concern, is that the separation of Eskom into 3 separate entities and the creation of an independent transmission grid is not about taking us forward to address the climate problem and the problem of energy supply in the country. Instead, it's to enable and facilitate the private sector involvement in energy generation, regardless of the detrimental costs and implications it will have.
No, thank you very much for those insights, Dominic. That is Dominic Brown. He is the head for Economic Justice Program at the Alternative Information and Development Center.